you're also going to have to sit through a bit of music as well, because I'm editing as I go. Told you, I've got all the gear and no idea. Let me just try one thing. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Shall we give this a go, Sean? And just Sean, I'm calling you Sean now. Yeah, exactly. That's only because I've just been speaking to Sean. So you can see how my day is all messed up already. Right, okay, let's see where this takes us. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Enigma. And I can't quite believe that we're now at episode 45. And it's been a real joy to focus on leaders and leadership. And let's be honest, we only have one body and we only have one mind, and they're inextricably linked. So we need to delve in to the mind for sure. So come back to me where we were talking to the wonderful Shane O'Mara, Professor of Experimental Brain Research, Trinity College, Dublin, psychologist, neuroscientist, and author as well. I know I'm feeling inadequate already, but come back to me straight after this.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Shane, welcome to the Leadership Enigma. How are you?
I'm good, Adam. Thank you. It's great to be here.
I would love the fact that you were smiling as you were listening to that intro. It happens all the time. And I bet you were working out which of those you are, or all of them. So I've been looking forward to this one. I look forward to all of these episodes because, as I said to you just before we went live, as you're talking, Shane, I'm selfishly learning, and so are all the listeners. Now, you've got an amazing background: psychologist, neuroscientist, professor of experimental brain research at Trinity College, and author of In Praise of Walking, which was an Amazon bestseller. How's all this happened, Shane?
By working consistently, turning up every day, and relying on the power of incremental change.
It's brilliant. So did you always want to go into neuroscientist? Did you always want to focus on brain research?
Yes, I think I did from probably about my mid-teens. And it happened simply because I watched a television series by the great American astronomer Carl Sagan, who was going on about exploring Mars and doing all sorts of amazing things. And I read some of his books and I just thought, wow, we can find out stuff. What an amazing way to live your life.
Well, we don't really understand, do we? Or maybe it's just me, the real power of the brain, the real power of our own onboard computer. And I think, let me ask you, this is a slightly strange question that's popped into my head. Is there something that sticks in your mind that has truly fascinated or surprised you in relation to how our brain works, or in my case doesn't? But has anything all stuck out over the years you thinking that's strange?
What strikes me is it sets us apart from all the other species on the planet.
Yep.
Is that we have a brain that's designed for hyper cooperativity and hypersociality, and we just simply don't recognize it because it's like the water we're in. I'll give you a simple example. You know,
Yeah.
if we were two chimpanzees in Africa, I've never met you in person. You haven't met me in person. If we did, we would fight. Whereas the two of us are smiling and having a good conversation together. You know, so that kind of tribalism, which we do manifest and can happen, is largely absent from our everyday interactions. You know, fire ants will do this to each other.
Right.
Tigers from different troops will do it to each other. But humans, I'll go out to my shop and I'll expect my milk hasn't been poisoned. You know, all of that, like this, the sinew of modern life is built around this cooperation we can engage in. And it's an astonishing achievement.
Now, your book was In Praise of Walking, and just give us a little overview of that, because it was about, wasn't it, just the fact that we can walk, and it's such a social thing, and it's such Well, you tell us. Why did you write that book, which was an Amazon bestseller?
Yeah, so there were two. So I wrote the book because my literary agent said I should write a book on walking.
That's
It's an
motivation
obvious
for
idea
you.
because I love walking. But when I decided to do it, what I wanted to do was tell a tale that was different from the average Stones and Bones story of how humans come to walk. And
Yeah.
kind of, you've already hinted at the kind of key point of the book, which is that actually what has been unrecognized is that our walking evolved in a social context. Humans conquered the world by walking out of Africa together in groups, in tribes, in families, in units. We wouldn't have done it with one guy with a spear walking off into the wilderness. It had to be together. And that means that we have to be highly attuned to each other in groups. And there are great examples of this. So, one of the examples that I give at the end of the book is how humans walk together to protest at things.
Right.
You've seen amazing marches over the past years
Yeah,
indicating just how unhappy people are. But about, for example, conditions among African Americans or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
But think about it abstractly. People are gathering, they're moving in a common direction. They feel a sense of well-being from being together. The boundary between self and other dissolves a little, and we're protesting against something abstract, a legal structure, a political structure. Chimpanzees won't do this, but humans do. It's a really remarkable and curious aspect of our behavior that is absent completely in the rest of the animal kingdom.
So that lends me to a question which I have to ask, because we're still dealing with a global pandemic. I've said this before, it's a shared experience globally. I work with leaders all over the world. We're all experiencing the pandemic, but we're experiencing it in a very, very individualistic way. Are you seeing any evidence of some of the challenges that human proximity was in some ways taken away from us for a while when we went to social distancing? I mean, that's an oxymoron already, isn't it? To be social, but to be distanced. Are you seeing anything in your research?
So that there are bits and pieces of work, and I think probably we shouldn't have used the phrase social distance. I think it's a very bad phrase.
I agree.
We should have used the phrase spatial distance, because of course, unless you're living alone, you're living with other people. Your family are around you. We're able now to go into shops with masks on and things like this. So we are maintaining some degree of distance. Now, there has been work, for example, in the UK by Stephen Reicher, tracking people's sense of well-being. And if I recall it correctly, what he's shown is that a fraction of the population's mental well-being has actually improved during the pandemic. There's a large group in the middle for whom there has been no change. Some things have been better, some things have been worse.
Right.
And one of the big gains has been a loss of commuting. People are,
yes, I don't miss that. I don't miss that, Shane.
Who misses that? You've got 2 hours back to your day, which you can do other things with. And then there's a group who have disimproved. These people tend to be concentrated in low socioeconomic status groups. They tend to be frontline people. And of course, there's that large group that have suffered terrible human loss. Loved ones have died or have been injured or whatever as a result of the pandemic. So I think there isn't a uniform story here, and I think one of the things that if I try and get it across in this interview, I'd be very pleased with the way the interview goes, is that we should be nuanced about how we think about how things affect people, because humans are clearly on a spectrum. There are we vary in all sorts of different ways, and we respond to things in all sorts of different ways.
So it will take some time, really, won't it?
It will take some time.
Really understand. And that takes me to another point, because we spoke before this call as regards productivity, and people are now reassessing productivity. The days maybe of being at a desk 9 till 5 have gone. The commute has gone. So there have been some benefits. How we work is changing. So this is now more about output. So let me ask a question about productivity. In the work and the research that you've been doing, what helps and what doesn't?
Yeah, so there's kind of lots of things to think about. And probably one of the best ways to think about is to think about what you can do for yourself,
right,
in terms of self-care. the first thing you must do to live a productive life is to sleep properly. Beyond any behavior that you can engage in, getting a proper night's sleep where you wake up in the morning feeling refreshed will leave you in a much better position to do creative knowledge work and sustain it day in, day out.
Right.
And sleep contributes in lots of different ways. One of them is just simply the recharge. Another that's really underestimated is that it has a profound effect on creative problem solving.
Okay.
And another effect that it has that people are completely unaware of is that sleep is necessary for the stabilization of memory in the brain. So you've got these three different things that sleep does for you. There are many other things it does as well. But in terms of kind of productive living, sleeping will benefit you in ways that you will find hard to credit. The second thing to do is to be as aerobically fit as you possibly can.
Right.
What's good for your heart is good for your brain. And we know if we bring it down to the most basic level, that if you get lots of walking in, if you get lots of running, if that's your thing, if you get lots of sport in, one of the things that's happening is your body is producing wonderful molecules called myokines, which travel all around the body, engaging in repair. So the tissues that have been injured or inflamed or whatever, all of those kinds of things can be stabilized, and you can actually build resilience through aerobic exercise. And then the other thing is when you're awake, time off the task that you're engaged in is as important as time on the task. We have this idea that, to solve a problem, it has to be front of your brain and you have to be chewing over it. But actually, you have a lot of things going on behind the scenes in your head that you're not aware of, and that can contribute to problem solving. So if you have a difficult problem, lots of preparation, think about it, and then stop, go do something else, go for a walk, go read a book, and then come back to the problem. You'll often find that the problem has actually been solved. And we can show this experimentally, of course.
So there are three key points there. I think I'm doing okay on the aerobic side of things, definitely not doing very well on the sleep side of things. So if you're ever up at 3 a.m., Shane, just call me, because I'll also be up anyway. And it's not a good thing, is it? And I assume as well that, we all have those 3 o'clock in the morning moments, but our brains are still working. Even if we walk away from a problem or a conundrum, I'm assuming that, is it still going on?
It's going on in the background.
Over?
Yeah, just because it's not front of head at that particular moment and you're not chewing over a thing in an anxious kind of way, doesn't mean that the problem isn't being worked on. It just, let me give you a very simple example of this. What color is your front door?
Brown.
Okay, so mine is gray. Where was that information 2 minutes ago?
Somewhere back here.
Exactly. And you can get that information instantly. And what's happening is there's turnover of these cognitive structures all the time that contribute to problem solving. If I ask you to point in the direction of your local shop, boom, you can do it. Mine is over there. You can do it without any trouble at all. If I ask you where your bicycle or your car is, you can point to those. We have access to this vast array of information, which is silent or latent. But the fact that it's silent doesn't mean that it's like what's happening in a computer. It's being turned over all the time. It's been reconfigured. Sleep does this for us in a really important way. But just because you're not focused on it consciously doesn't mean that at the back of your head something isn't going on.
Now, Shane, my wife says I can't multitask. Anything? Can we actually multitask, or do we have to do one thing at a time?
As we speak. The kind of multitasking that humans excel at is interaction like this,
right,
where you're talking to me, you're predicting what I'm going to say, you're anticipating your next question, you're waiting for the break in the conversation, and we'll flip between each other in about a fifth of a second. Otherwise, multitasking is really hard. What people do is what's called continuous partial attention. A little bit
that
on
sounds
this,
like me.
A little bit on that, a little bit on the other.
Or in my case, it might be ADHD. I'm not sure, but this is good. So episode 45 has allowed me now to officially go back to my wife and say that the professor of experimental brain research at Trinity College, Dublin, says I can indeed multitask. I jest, but no, trust me, I'll take any win that I can. Let's talk a little bit about mindsets, because we hear a lot about mindsets, especially in the world of leaders and leadership. And I want to do this in two stages. One of them is, what on earth actually is a mindset? Does that exist? And the second question is, can we change a mindset? So let's start with that. What is a mindset?
Yeah, so a mindset is this idea originally brought out by Carol Dweck,
Yep.
professor of psychology at Stanford. And
Yes.
it's a very powerful and very useful kind of idea around how people conceive of themselves. So she suggests that when you look at populations of learners, populations of people who are tasked with doing jobs, there are people who have what she calls a fixed mindset, which
Yes.
is that they're focused on getting praise for doing for themselves for having done the task, and they're people who basically eschew challenges because they're afraid of being shown up. And then there are people who have a quote unquote growth mindset, and these are people who look for challenges, whose the praise and reward they seek is for having executed the task rather than for their own great talents. And I think this is a kind of a very useful way of thinking about how people behave. That survey after survey do show consistently that people do approach problem solving in different ways. Some people refuse to get stuck into the weeds of challenging problems because they'd be shown up as not being able to do the task, whereas others embrace failure as a
Yes.
chance to learn. And that's the kind of core difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And there's little doubt, I think, when people have found this in children, in primary school, it
Yes.
turns up in teenagers, and it turns up in adults. There are characteristic ways we approach things.
I know that it's been something that's been focused on for some time, and it's very popular, fixed and growth mindset. And I've been involved in sport most of my life, and watch my kids as well in sport, and I can see its application certainly in relation to how they learn, how they fail, how they bounce back, the resilient nature that they may or may not have. But can we actually change a mindset? Because I know there are a lot of people out there who suggest that we can, but you have a view on this.
Yeah, so I think we have to be led by the evidence where this is concerned. And a lot of the early work suggested in educational settings that it was really easy to change mindsets, that you could flip a fixed mindset to a growth mindset with a short intervention.
Right.
Typically, watch a video for a half an hour and read a paragraph on the plasticity of the brain. And I think the problem is that short intervention doesn't seem to be true, that it has powerful effects. The best data that I know of is a very large scale pre-registered study that Dweck and her colleagues published in Nature Neuroscience, I think, about 2 years ago,
Right.
involving a very large population of the order of 90,000 students. And what they found in that population was that the bottom performing 20%, you could boost academic performance, at least in the short term, by these short interventions, but it didn't really have much of an effect on the rest of the population. So
Right.
it may be that when you're looking at very, very large numbers of people, that these short interventions can have a profound effect on a bottom performing fraction of the population. But shifting a fixed mindset to a growth mindset in individuals in a predictable way, I don't think we're anywhere close to that yet. I don't think the evidence is reliable enough for that. And what I would actually suggest is, instead of focusing on the individual, what we need to do is focus on the culture around the individual,
Okay.
where it's okay to fail, and people are given permission to make mistakes, and they're given specific training to facilitate them in overcoming those mistakes. And this is something actually sports psychologists and sports trainers are very, very good at now, because there's a metric there, which is that you have to cycle the fastest. You have to win the championship or whatever it happens to be. So there's a kind of a selection effect that goes along that chooses behaviors that overcome the kind of problems that might be presented by the way an individual characteristically approaches things.
So as we work with leaders across the world, Are we saying that you can still change your mindset? There is hope to sometimes reframe our thinking, but it's going to take time, effort.
I think that's correct, and I think the issue is that we shouldn't focus on the individual so much as the culture within which we're embedded.
And I think,
So things like trust,
right.
cooperativity, respect, reciprocity, all of those kinds of things. If you're in an environment where your superior is abusive, you're just going to go, give up. Why should I? And all the focus on growth mindsets there is completely irrelevant. The problem is the dysfunctional person,
Right.
Who's got the power in the relationship. So I think, the problem with mindset as a concept is that people have adopted it as this kind of monocausal answer to big problems, when actually it's a part of a solution within a larger frame.
So that actually really, I think in many ways gives power to the argument that culture is so important, and the environment that we create. Now, I'm passionate about human-centered leadership, and we've spoken before about this, and we're talking about innate human capabilities. So inclusivity, curiosity, vigilance, personal purpose, as opposed to our technical skills. I became a lawyer, so I had to rely on my technical skills in order to qualify and be confident and competent. But as time has gone on, and there's perhaps more of a leadership challenge, now I'm relying more on the innate human capabilities. What do you think in relation to just how powerful the ability to be humble and to be curious and to be vigilant are for modern day leaders?
Yeah, I actually think these kinds of things are absolutely key and central to leadership. And when you've occupied a leadership position, so I've been a director of a neuroscience institute, you discover really, you're not the all-powerful person pushing all the buttons, because people, money, and space are always going to be a problem, and resolving conflicts between people is not going to be a question of you coming in and kind of doing here, top down, I'm going to push the button here and make this problem go away. Life isn't like that. Life is much more messy. So creating a culture within which people are respected, their autonomy is respected, their problem-solving capabilities, their ability to bring information to you that you're not aware of, because humans, as we've discussed before, are cognitively frail, we're cognitively bounded. We've got limited bandwidth for things, and there's lots of stuff we just simply don't know. So being willing to listen, being willing to let other people be heard, all of those kinds of things are core competences for a leader.
Now, Shane, you mentioned the phrase cognitively frail. So here's a question for you. I know you're doing some work at the moment as regards institutions as extended cognitive structures. Help us understand that and why you're focusing on that right now.
Yeah, so I think there's a really interesting problem here regarding how we organize ourselves into institutions. This again is another remarkable aspect of human life, which is completely absent in chimpanzee life. You don't go.
Your work is never done, Shane. That's what I'm hearing.
Exactly. So what I think there's a useful way of thinking about institutions, not as legal entities or sociological or political entities. Think about how institutions are created and sustained. What they're created and sustained by is people engaging in shared decision making, and they have formal and informal repositories of memory.
Right.
And I think this is one of the things that has been kind of lost a little because of the pandemic. We're not interacting in the ways that we used to, so that the kind of shared processes that we would engage in, this kind of extended mind idea, is something that's a little bit absent. And for a knowledge worker who's working on coding for some interesting problem, that may not be an issue. But if you're a leader who's trying to build an organization to be greater than it happens currently to be, well, then the kind of informal interactions where we bring different elements of our thinking together and surface those because of the interactions that we have, that's currently absent. So I think one of the big tasks we're going to have coming out of the the pandemic, because we have vaccines now, will be to somehow create these hybrid mechanisms where, nobody wants to go back to commuting a couple of hours a day. It's horrible. Nobody wants to go back to working in a smelly office where it's badly ventilated, when productivity is actually better under many circumstances at home. But at the same time, we humans do need to interact together. And, us being able to do this across the water in this way is fantastic. But for kind of ordinary work life, we need to see each other face to face as well.
Well, there's that spark, isn't there? And I think that takes me to my next question. When I talk about inclusivity, I'm not just talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm talking about diversity of thought. And I know you've had some thoughts about cognitive diversity. So how are leaders going to really embark on solving that challenge in what will be a post-pandemic environment where everything has maybe changed to still get and harness that diversity of thought? So we're sparking off each other. There's that innovation, that creativity, and that collaboration. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think, am I right in thinking that if we're together in a room, Shane, and we're bouncing off each other's energy and we're flip charting and we're post-it noting on the wall, we've missed that.
Yeah, and there's no way that anybody can pretend that doing that over Zoom is something that's going to work. We can't read each other's behavior properly. If one of us is starting to feel like you're talking too much and I really need to say this, that's hard in a Zoom context. Or if I've got an idea that I'm really happy with, I need to get it out there on the whiteboard with the pen quickly. That all of those kinds of collaborative aspects. So I think the smart thing to do is actually to try and do away with meetings, because we have too many meetings, but actually foster deliberate interactions that are either kind of scheduled, where people meet up on a basis, whatever the basis happens to be, to talk about a problem, whatever that problem happens to be. And also, given that we're going to have slightly different work patterns in future, we're going to have to get better about scheduling time for people just to do things that we already do informally. I can knock on the office next door and go and have a cup of coffee. We need to think a bit more cleverly about how to do those things. I don't have a good answer, to be honest. I think we're in an evolving context. But I think, coming back to a theme from a little bit earlier, one of the things that we do need to do is to trust people a bit more. Most people are good people. Most people want to work. They want to get things done, and they want a sense of achievement. This quote unquote need for achievement is something that's present in lots of people. So we don't need authoritarian styles of leadership anymore, however comforting that might be to the authoritarian. But a shouty man is not going to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to my old police days now when you talk about a shouty man or the drill sergeant. So in many ways, leaders are going to have to reframe the way that they trust people, because being behind a desk 9 till 5 is not necessary anymore.
No, it's
in
not.
some ways, that was archaic thinking, perhaps.
Yeah.
And we were wrong. And I know someone said, I read an article recently that said, essentially, we have shuttled ourselves 5 years forward in the space of about 9 months.
Yeah, I think we have done that. And I think, there's kind of a larger structural issue for society. I don't know what's going to happen in the UK, but here in Ireland, the government has embarked on a national broadband plan, which would bring broadband to all of the remote parts of the West Coast, for example. Right. And they're building hubs around community centres and other places where people can interact. Okay. And I think, we need to be thinking about leveraging how people interact together, because that's where creativity really happens. And at the same time, facilitating people not having to go in on the train, as I usually would have done, to work every day, because there are other and better ways of organizing our lives. So how we build our towns and cities in the future, I think we're going to have to stop this business of, here's the central business district, here's the production district, here are the suburbs, and we have to do commutes between all of these places. And we're going to have to look at a much more distributed organization. Like you go to the old medieval towns of Italy, for example. You'll have a tannery beside a jeweler, beside a watchmaker, or whatever it would happen to have been. And you have this kind of the services naturally accrue rather than being dictated from the center.
So we've got that balance, haven't we? Connectivity creates inclusivity, but we've got to find that balance, as you say.
Yeah. Okay. And that's going to be a moving target, you know. We're going to have to think about things like, well, are we getting rid of cars? Are we going to facilitate electric scooters and electric bikes? Right. If we're going to do that, well, where are we going to store them? How are people going to have showers if they're very sweaty after having cycled for 8 miles? Or, you know, there's a whole load of micro issues that actually we as individuals can't solve. Our governments are going to have to think about them, but they're going to have to think about them in much more flexible ways than they would have done previously.
And I'm assuming many of those we still haven't even identified. What are the true ongoing consequences of the pandemic? And I'm not talking about that in a purely negative way. That actually could be in an opportunistic way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if we have this conversation in a year's time and we've all been vaccinated, will it be the case that restaurants will be back in the way that they were? Who knows? You know, a year ago, who was into meal kits? And now suddenly meal kits are everywhere. Maybe we'll get sick of making our own food. Maybe there'll be hybrids. You know, I think there's all sorts of opportunities that weren't present previously that are present, that will come up. And humans are amazingly ingenious, creative problem solvers. We should give a bit more space, if we can at all, to allow people to find these opportunities.
Well, that takes me to another question, because we've talked about cognitive fragility, and we're all cognitively frail, aren't we? And that's a useful question, I hope, because a lot of leaders, I think, sometimes think they have to have all the answers. They have to be incredibly resilient and strong. And yes, perhaps to all of those things, but maybe there's also some comfort in everyone understanding that we are cognitively frail. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so humans are, I'll use the word cognitive a few times now, humans are cognitive misers. Thinking is hard. Right. Problem solving is difficult. And what we want is shortcuts. And, you know, if you think about being out in the African plains 50,000 years ago, you didn't have a long time to decide if that moving yellow thing over there was a tiger or an antelope or just a bush.
Yep.
You had to make a decision quickly and you had to move fast. And you did that on the basis of imperfect information. And we have all sorts of biases that are built into us for decision making that actually, especially in the modern world, can be self-defeating. So one thing that humans do all the time is to gather data that supports the point of view that they're in favor of, the so-called confirmation bias.
Yeah.
They don't go out and deliberately test how they might be wrong. But we need this in organizations. You know, if you're going to engage in let's say, for example, a purchase of another company, what you need to do is what's now being referred to as a pre-mortem. Don't think about all the reasons why this thing is a good idea. Assume it's been a terrible idea and figure out all the reasons why it might have been a terrible idea, and do that before you do anything. Yes. You know, so deliberately figuring out why we're bad at and knowing these kind of biases that we have is a good strategy. And let me give you another example that's just literally was published in a wonderful paper in Nature last week.
Right.
On subtraction. If you get people to solve difficult problems, these can be maths problems, they can be social problems, they can be problems of brick building or Lego or whatever it happens to be. And you ask people to figure out rules that will make problem solving better. What we do persistently is add complexity. What we don't do is think about how we can make the problem simpler by subtracting elements from it.
Right.
Our bias always is to take the problem and add something to it. So this is why we end up with these enormously complicated financial instruments. We end up with these enormously complicated institutions, to come back to a thought earlier. And the desire to simplify is something that we all persistently avoid. I'll give a small example. I was working on a paper with some colleagues over the last few weeks, and we had some statistical analyses in the paper. And there were 2 sentences that were killing us. And we tossed them backwards and forwards in order to get this paper over the line. And I was looking at them and looking at them and looking at them. And in the end, I said, let's just delete them. And my co-authors went, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. The paper is actually better for our not attempting to explain something that was already obvious to the reader. And we didn't need to spend hours sweating bullets over a couple of sentences that actually just didn't need to leave in at all. I know that's a very small scale example, but just thinking about how we can make things better by making things simpler is something that humans are not good at. We always complexify when we should be trying to simplify.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the best advice I got, I think, as a trial lawyer in front of judge and jury. For Lord's sake, just keep it simple. And I think that's what we're talking about here. Shane, I could talk to you forever, which wouldn't be fair on you. But how can people get in touch to learn more, to start a conversation with you, to engage with you in relation to some of the amazing work and research you're doing? Best way of getting in touch?
Yeah, so there's probably three simple ways.
Okay.
The first is to go to my website, shaneomara.com. You could sign up for my newsletter, which is brainpizza.substack.com.
Yes.
Or you could follow me on Twitter, ShaneOmara3. I'm not very active on Twitter, but I post lots of photos to Instagram. Okay. So at Shane Writer on Instagram. So there's actually 4.
And LinkedIn as well? Are you on LinkedIn?
And I'm on LinkedIn as well, of course.
Wow, you are a social media guru then. I think that's every platform. You're going to be telling me it'll be TikTok next as well. I said that.
I leave that to my daughter.
Yeah, exactly. I leave that to my teenagers. Listen, it's been amazing to talk to you, and I want to finish on one little bit of a fun question, and that is, what would be your best advice to a 21-year-old Shane?
I think the best advice would be to go and travel as soon as you possibly can. Go and see the world through other people's eyes. It's something that I didn't do enough of pre-pandemic, or I did it far too much in a business context. But I think, there's wonderful places around the world, and you will learn this lesson that you can fly into an airport in Singapore, and people there aren't going to be horrible to you. They're going to treat you with respect. You'll be able to go out, get on public transport, and you'll be able to eat a meal. You can fly to India or whatever it happens to be. And humans have this astonishing capacity for cooperativity. Don't do it, obviously. Be careful about where you... There are parts of the world that are inherently dangerous, and you need to be careful about those. But I think to travel is really one of the very best things you could possibly do.
I love that, and I have a 17-year-old daughter who is planning on doing just that after her A-levels. Shane, this has been amazing. I hope you've enjoyed it. There is so much for us to talk about that I'm going to ask you to come back and do another episode on the Leadership Enigma if you would consider doing that.
I would be delighted to.
Listen, take great care where you are, and thank you very much for doing this fantastic episode.
Thank you.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.